When I first stepped across the threshold of our house in Carmel by the sea, everything felt almost unreal. The ocean breeze carried the scent of salt and something indescribably fresh, the kind of scent you can only experience near the water. Our new home perched on a hillside, offering a view of the boundless horizon. Light curtains on the windows swayed gently in the breeze, and David, my husband, watched me with a smile as I took in every detail, like a child unwrapping a long-anticipated gift. "Well, what do you think?" he asked, coming up behind me and wrapping his arms around my shoulders. "This is better than I could have ever imagined," I replied, tilting my head back slightly to look up at him. He was 52, but his energy and zest for life made his age irrelevant. David was a photographer, a man who saw the world through the lens of light and shadow, always finding beauty in it. With him, I felt safe, as if all the worries of life were left somewhere far beyond the horizon. Every morning began with a walk along the shore. We strolled barefoot on the cold sand, sometimes in silence, sometimes discussing our plans. He shared his ideas for new photography projects, and I spoke of my hopes of finding myself in this little paradise. In the evenings, we sat on the veranda with glasses of wine, watching the sun dip below the horizon, flooding everything around us in a rich orange glow. At times, it felt like we had an eternity ahead of us. We lived in the moment, as if in a scene from a movie, where every ray of light, every sound of the ocean was perfectly orchestrated. But I didn't yet know that in the background, almost imperceptibly, another story was already beginning to unfold. That day, the sun disappeared behind soft clouds, leaving a gentle silvery light on the horizon. David, looking at me with a warm smile, announced, "We're having a guest today. Nathan is coming up from Los Angeles." I already knew about his stepson. 28 years old, successful, working in a startup, and passionate about traveling. David always spoke about him with pride, though their relationship hadn't always been easy. The divorce from Nathan's mother had been painful, and I suspected it had left a mark on both their lives. Still, David spared no effort in rebuilding his bond with his son. When Nathan walked into the house, the first thing I noticed was the confidence in his every movement. He was tall, athletic, with an easygoing sense of style, and an expression that seemed to say, "I know who I am." His gaze was both kind and piercing, as if he could instantly read the person in front of him. "Anna?" he asked, stepping closer and extending his hand. "Nathan, nice to finally meet you." His voice was calm and assured, with a faint touch of curiosity. I smiled and shook his hand, trying to hide a slight awkwardness. It was one of those moments when meeting someone new unexpectedly feels important, even if you hadn't planned on it. "We're glad you're here," I replied, aware of David watching our first interaction. Dinner was simple, but warm. We ate seafood pasta, drank white wine, and shared laughs. Nathan told stories from his life in Los Angeles, about how he once accidentally ended up at a dinner with a famous director, or how a colleague had fallen asleep during an important presentation. I laughed along with him, feeling the tension slowly dissolve. He was charismatic, effortlessly matching the rhythm of the conversation as if he'd always been part of the family. But at some point, I noticed something that made me pause. His gaze. It lingered on me just a moment too long. It was more than polite attentiveness. In his eyes, I caught a strange mix of interest and an enigmatic tension that made me feel slightly uncomfortable. Maybe I'm imagining things, I told myself. It's just his way of engaging with people. Nothing personal. Yet the voice in my head wouldn't quiet down. David, on the other hand, seemed oblivious. He was happy, watching his wife and son find common ground. He raised his glass, toasting to family, to being here together in this house. Later, after the evening wound down and Nathan left for his hotel, I sat alone on the veranda, listening to the whispers of the waves. The cool breeze brushed against my face, but the memory of what I had felt during dinner both warmed and unsettled me. I wanted to convince myself that nothing unusual had happened, but the image of his lingering gaze refused to fade. The next day, David suggested spending the morning on the shore. It was part of his new photo shoot, and he wanted Nathan and me to help. We met outside the house early in the morning when the air was cool and fresh, and the ocean shimmered under the first rays of sunlight. Nathan wore jeans and a light jacket, looking so at ease and natural, as if he had spent his entire life in places like this. "Great morning for work, isn't it?" he said casually as we loaded cameras, tripods, and a few boxes of props into the car. "If you call a walk on the beach work, then absolutely," I replied with a smile. His lighthearted attitude helped ease the lingering tension I felt from the previous night's dinner. I tried to convince myself that everything was just in my head. After all, he was my husband's son, and his attention couldn't mean anything more than an attempt to build a friendly relationship. We arrived at a spot where cliffs jutted into the water, and the stretch of sand seemed endless. David was engrossed in his work, setting up equipment and adjusting the lighting. He always transformed when he picked up a camera, focused yet brimming with inspiration. "Anna, can you help me with this?" he called out, gesturing to a heavy case of lighting equipment. I stepped over to assist, but before I could lift the box, Nathan had already taken it. "I've got it. Don't want you complaining about your back later," he said with a wink. The gesture was simple, but I felt a faint unease again. He was attentive, maybe a little too much. We got to work, carrying equipment and arranging props. At one point, Nathan came over and started a conversation about music. "You know, you have an incredible eye for cinema," he said when we were discussing Tarantino. "I didn't expect to meet someone who pays attention to such detail." I laughed, brushing it off. "I just watch a lot. It's more of a habit than a skill." But he looked at me with such seriousness that my words suddenly felt inadequate. At one point, when David stepped away to take a phone call, Nathan and I were left alone near the water's edge. The ocean roared softly, waves rolling onto the shore and leaving thin lines of foam in their wake. Nathan skipped a flat stone across the surface, watching it bounce a few times before sinking. "Do you like this place?" he asked unexpectedly. "Very much. It's easy to breathe here," I replied, unsure where he was going with the question. He nodded, then looked at me. His gaze was too direct, too prolonged. "It suits you. You fit here, like you've always been a part of this landscape." I didn't get a chance to respond because David returned and called us over to help with another camera setup. But those words lingered with me, like the sound of the waves that continued to echo in my mind long after I left the shore. By the end of the day, we were exhausted but content. David looked inspired, talking about his plans for editing the photos and even hinting at a possible exhibit. Nathan and I simply nodded along, too tired to contribute much to the conversation. When we got back to the house, I noticed Nathan lingering by the door to say goodbye. He paused on the threshold, smiling. "Thanks for the day," he said, looking directly at me. "Thank you. You were a great help," I replied, trying to sound as casual as he did. "Well, if you ever need me again, I'm always up for it," he added with a slight tilt of his head. That evening, while David was delayed at a client meeting, I found myself alone at home. I considered settling on the couch with a book, but couldn't concentrate. Nathan's words about how I fit into this landscape kept playing in my head. Foolish as it seemed, I replayed our conversation over and over, trying to convince myself it meant nothing. A knock at the door interrupted my thoughts. Nathan stood on the threshold. His presence surprised me, not for the knock itself, but for the expression on his face. Instead of his usual confident smile, there was a faint trace of hesitation, as if he wasn't entirely sure why he was here. "Are you alone?" he asked, glancing up. "Yes. David said he'd be late. Did you need something?" I asked, trying to sound as calm as he looked. "Just thought I'd stop by. It's a long evening and I couldn't think of anything to do." He shrugged, like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Maybe we could have dinner?" I hesitated. Refusing felt unnecessarily rude. After all, it was just dinner, and both of us knew David would be happy to see us strengthening our bond. "All right, but I haven't cooked anything," I said cautiously. "Not a problem. I know a place by the waterfront." "You won't go hungry," he replied, a subtle smile appearing on his face. We ended up in a small cafe with wooden tables and windows overlooking the ocean. Inside, it was warm, with soft music playing in the background. We ordered grilled fish and salads, and the conversation flowed easily. Nathan talked about his work at the startup, describing the app they were developing for travelers. Sounds exciting, I remarked. Mostly it's stress and sleepless nights, but I love it. You know, when you're building something of your own, it's not just work, it becomes a part of you, he said, his voice softening as though he were speaking about something far more personal. I nodded, feeling myself relax. But then his gaze lingered on me again, just a little too long. You look like this whole town envies you, he said suddenly. I frowned slightly, unsure how to respond. It felt too personal. What do you mean? I asked cautiously. You glow, like you've found your place. I noticed it as soon as I arrived, he said, his voice gentle but full of conviction. I leaned back, trying to mask my unease. It's just a compliment, I told myself. He doesn't mean anything by it, but part of me didn't believe that. I think it's just the effect of living near the ocean, I replied, trying to deflect with a light-hearted tone. He smiled, but his gaze remained serious. Maybe. The rest of the evening passed without further hints, but his words continued to echo in my mind as we drove home. He played soft, relaxing music in the car. I stared out the window, focusing on the sights of the city at night, hoping to clear my thoughts. When we pulled up to the house, he turned off the engine and looked at me. Thanks for the company. It was a good evening, he said. Yes, thank you, I replied, avoiding his gaze. He nodded and stepped out of the car, opening my door for me. In that moment, I felt the tension again. Something unspoken seemed to linger in the air, a weight neither of us dared to address. Good night, I said quickly, not waiting for him to speak, and hurried into the house. The next day began like any other. David was making coffee. Nathan was lazily scrolling through something on his phone at the dining table, and I was organizing the kitchen shelves to make room for the fresh produce from the local farmer's market. But deep inside, an unshakable sense of unease lingered. Every time Nathan spoke to me or was simply nearby, I felt a strange tension, as if something invisible yet palpable was forming between us. After breakfast, Nathan approached me, holding a book with a worn cover. This is for you, he said, handing it to me. What is it? I asked, accepting the gift. My favorite book. I thought you might like it. The protagonist reminds me of you, he said. I glanced at the title. It was a novel I'd heard of but never read. His gesture was thoughtful, but his words made me wary. The protagonist reminds me of you. Why? What did he mean by that? Thank you. I'll make sure to read it, I replied, trying to mask my confusion. He smiled, and this time it seemed purely kind, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that there was more behind his actions than met the eye. Later that day, Nathan offered to help me tidy up the garden that David and I were still in the process of landscaping. He turned out to be surprisingly skilled and patient. We worked side by side, pulling weeds, discussing flower bed designs, and brainstorming which plants would thrive best. Our conversation flowed easily, but occasionally there were moments of silence that felt too charged. At one point, I looked up to find him watching me. What? I asked, trying not to show my discomfort. He smirked slightly, as though catching himself in the act. Nothing. Just thinking. I turned away, feeling my cheeks warm slightly. This is silly, I told myself. He's just a curious, friendly young man. Yet something stirred within me, something I couldn't quite name. Later, when we finished, he suggested a cup of coffee. We sat on the veranda, gazing at the ocean. Nathan spoke passionately about his love for mountaineering, recounting his climbs in Yosemite and the risks and freedom he felt in the mountains. I listened with genuine interest, captivated by the fervor in his words. You're brave, I remarked when he finished his story. Maybe, but the mountains are honest. You either climb or you don't. No games, He paused, his eyes meeting mine. I wish life were that simple. I felt his words hang in the air as if he were waiting for me to respond, but I didn't know what to say. We sat in silence, watching as the sun inched closer to the horizon. When he finally left, I noticed it again. His gaze. It lingered on me just a little too long. I didn't know how to handle it, but inside me, a feeling I didn't want to name began to grow. The sun was at its peak, flooding the beach with a blinding light. David and I headed out for another photo shoot, this time for his latest project. He was capturing the natural beauty of the coastline, but with Nathan volunteering to help, I couldn't shake the feeling that his presence had shifted the atmosphere. David was fully absorbed in his work, pacing the sand, adjusting lighting and angles, immersed in creative energy. At one point, he asked me to stay with Nathan and prepare some of the props. I've got a few more shots to take. He called over his shoulder without looking at us. Anna, Nathan, organize everything here. I'll join you soon. That left just the two of us. The sea was restless, waves crashing against the rocks, their roar louder than I would have liked. I focused on the task at hand, checking boxes, sorting items, anything to distract myself. But I couldn't ignore Nathan's presence nearby, his closeness almost tangible. You've changed him, you know, Nathan said suddenly, breaking the silence. I turned to him, frowning slightly. What do you mean? My dad. You've changed him. He's different now. Happy, he said, his tone steady but carrying an undercurrent of something deeper. I didn't think he'd ever be like this again after the divorce with my mom. His words touched me. That's not just because of me, I replied. He wanted it for himself. Nathan nodded, but his gaze remained fixed on me. And you? Are you happy? His question caught me off guard. I felt the words stick in my throat. Of course, I said, trying to sound certain. Are you? He stepped closer. Not too close, but enough for that strange tension between us to feel almost electric. Sometimes I think you haven't completely found yourself here. Why would you say that? I asked, startled by his boldness. Just a feeling. You give so much to others, but I'm not sure you do anything for yourself. His words struck a nerve. He was speaking to something I hadn't dared confront. Before meeting David, my life had been a whirlwind of uncertainty, torn between dreams and reality. With David, I'd found stability. But was that truly what I had been searching for? I dropped my gaze, struggling to compose myself. That's none of your business, Nathan. I'm sorry, he said, his voice quiet but resolute. I can't help noticing. We stood there for a moment, the space between us thick with unspoken emotions, until David's voice called out to us, breaking the tension. Later, as we drove home, David was in high spirits, animatedly discussing the details of the shoot. But I barely heard him. Nathan's voice echoed in my mind. His question, his gaze. And the most unsettling part? I realized I couldn't give myself an honest answer. The family dinner unfolded as usual. David animatedly shared updates about his recent successes, while Nathan seemed fully immersed in the conversation with his father, discussing the finer details of an upcoming project. I tried to focus on the food and the chatter, but my thoughts wandered far afield. Nathan's question from the beach still echoed in my mind, like the lingering crash of a wave that refused to fade. At some point, amidst the jokes and plans, Nathan casually mentioned, I think I'll stay here a bit longer than I originally planned. David, surprised but pleased, responded enthusiastically. That's great. You can really help with the project. The two of us will get things done so much faster. I looked up at Nathan. You mentioned you had important matters to handle in Los Angeles, I said cautiously. He met my gaze calmly, a faint smile playing on his lips. Sometimes you find a place where you want to stay. His words made me tense. What exactly did he mean? The place? The people? I searched his expression for a clue, but his composure gave nothing away. Only I noticed the slightest shift in his tone. Subtle, yet undeniable. When dinner ended, I resolved to get answers. After David retreated to his studio to work, I found Nathan on the veranda. He stood leaning against the railing, staring at the endless, dark expanse of the ocean. "Can I ask you something?" I began, trying to infuse my voice with steadiness. He turned, slightly surprised by my tone. "Of course. Why did you decide to stay?" I stepped closer but kept a safe distance. "The real reason." For a moment, his gaze lingered on me before he tilted his head back and laughed softly. "You're direct, Anna. I like that." "I'm serious," I insisted. His smile faded and he turned back to the ocean. "Maybe it's the place. Maybe it's the people who live here. Maybe it's something else." My heart raced. "Nathan, don't speak in riddles." He turned abruptly, his eyes meeting mine, and for a moment they were disarmingly intense. "All right, then I'll be direct. It's you." I froze. His words, spoken with calm certainty, struck me like lightning. "What?" I barely whispered. "You. I didn't expect it, but I can't ignore how I feel." My head spun as I scrambled to find the right words, but none of them seemed to fit. You realize what you're saying? This is wrong." "I know, but I can't control it," he said softly, almost a whisper, but the sincerity in his voice frightened me. I stepped back instinctively, creating a barrier of space between us. "This shouldn't have happened. We can't. It's wrong, Nathan." He nodded silently, as though bracing himself for my response, but his eyes held no regret, only pain. "I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted you to know." I stood there, speechless, as the waves below roared in the darkness. His words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting, and I felt the ground beneath me shift in ways I wasn't prepared for. That night, I couldn't find peace. David had fallen asleep in his studio, reviewing footage, and I couldn't bring myself to go to bed. My thoughts were chaotic. Nathan's words echoed in my head over and over. His gaze, his confession. I felt torn between duty and something I couldn't name. Taking a glass of wine, I stepped onto the veranda to breathe in the fresh air. The ocean was black, like an endless abyss, its roar rolling onto the shore like a melody tuned to a mournful key. I stood leaning against the railing, trying to calm my racing heart, but it refused to slow. I heard the door open. Nathan stepped onto the veranda. He looked calm, but there was a carefulness in his movements, like someone trying not to shatter a fragile moment. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, approaching slowly. I shook my head without turning to him. "No." For a few seconds, he said nothing, then stood nearby, leaving a few steps between us. "Are you angry with me?" His voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but his words felt louder than the sound of the waves. I didn't know how to answer. "I don't know." He looked at me, but I couldn't meet his eyes. "If I could take it back, I probably would have stayed silent," he said, staring into the distance. "But it would have been unbearable to pretend I didn't feel anything." I turned to him, and our eyes met. "This doesn't change anything, Nathan." "It's wrong." "I know," he said, taking a small step closer. "But some things happen not because they're right or wrong. They just happen." I wanted to turn away, to stop him, to end this, but instead I felt something inside me yield. He raised his hand but didn't touch me, as if silently asking for permission. I said nothing, but I didn't move away. He leaned in and our lips met. The kiss was soft. I froze, knowing I should stop it, but instead my eyes closed and I kissed him back. His hand gently touched my face and everything else seemed to vanish. The sound of the waves, the night around us, all fading into the background, leaving only this impossible moment. "Number, this can't go on," I whispered, pulling away and avoiding his gaze. He didn't try to come closer again, just nodded, as if he understood that it had to end this way. "I'm sorry," he said, but his voice carried no regret. I turned and hurried back into the house, closing the door behind me. Guilt coursed through me, heavy and suffocating, but deep down I couldn't deny that this feeling wasn't one-sided. The next morning, I woke earlier than everyone else, feeling utterly drained. The night had been filled with torturous thoughts, and now every movement felt labored, as though I was shackled by invisible chains. Nathan appeared later, and the tension in the room became almost unbearable. He acted as if nothing had happened, greeting David warmly and diving into a discussion about the project. But I noticed how he avoided looking at me. I couldn't tell if he did so out of respect or fear. When David left for his studio, leaving the two of us alone, it felt as though the walls of the room had closed in. Nathan stood across from me. "We need to talk," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He nodded as if he'd been expecting this. "I know what you're going to say." "Do you?" I asked, irritation rising at his confidence. "That it was a mistake," he said, looking me straight in the eye. "That it shouldn't have happened." "Because it's true," I replied, barely managing to keep my voice even. "We both know it never should have happened." He took a deep breath, lowering his gaze for a moment. "But you know I don't regret it." I closed my eyes, trying to manage the surge of emotions inside me. "Nathan, that doesn't matter. This will destroy everything we've built. I will destroy it." He took a step closer, but didn't cross the invisible line I seemed to have drawn between us. "Anna, I'm not asking for anything, but I can't pretend I feel differently." "You have to," I said sharply. "For your father, for all of us." Silence fell between us, heavy and suffocating. I didn't know how to end this conversation, but I knew it would haunt me. "I'm sorry about last night," he finally said, lowering his eyes. "I never meant to make your life harder." His apology sounded genuine, but I could see the conflict within him. He was apologizing, but he didn't regret it. "Thank you," I replied, a hint of relief in my voice. And with that, the conversation ended. In the days that followed, the tension in the house became almost unbearable. I avoided Nathan as much as possible, dodging his glances, cutting conversations short, and keeping my distance. Yet his presence was a constant reminder of every misstep we had taken. David began to notice the change. He was too perceptive not to see the shift in our dynamic. His questions grew increasingly direct, though they remained laced with caution. "Are you all right, Anna?" he asked one evening as we sat alone at dinner. "Yes, of course," I replied, far too quickly. His gaze lingered on me longer than usual, but he said nothing more. I knew he could feel something slipping away, but wasn't ready to confront it. A few days later, everything unraveled. It happened in the evening when David left for a meeting, leaving Nathan and me alone in the house. I tried to stay away, retreating to the bedroom with a book, but the tension in the air was suffocating, like a dense fog. When I went to the kitchen to get a glass of water, Nathan was there. He stood by the window, holding a glass of wine, his expression a mixture of longing and determination. "We need to talk," he said before I could leave. "About what?" I asked, striving to keep my voice steady. "About what happened between us," he said, his voice low but firm. "Nathan, it needs to stay in the past. We've already discussed this." But he didn't stop. "Do you really think we can just forget it? Pretend like nothing happened?" At that moment, I heard the sound of a car engine outside. I froze. David had come home earlier than expected. "This isn't the time or place," I said sharply, heading toward the door. But before I could leave, David walked into the kitchen. His eyes immediately picked up on the tension between us, the way we avoided looking at each other. "What's going on here?" he asked, frowning. I felt the blood drain from my face. Nathan didn't respond immediately, and I realized that the truth was slipping out, becoming impossible to hide. "David," I began, my voice trembling. "Number, I want to hear it from you," he said, turning to Nathan, his voice hardening. "What is going on here?" Nathan looked at me, as if seeking permission. His gaze was full of regret, but I could see he had no intention of lying. Something happened between us. Something that shouldn't have. He said quietly but clearly. David stood frozen, as if he had been struck. His eyes darted between me and Nathan, trying to process what he had just heard. "Anna, is this true?" he asked, his voice hollow. I lowered my head, unable to speak. My silence was answer enough. The silence that followed was suffocating. David took a step back, his face a mixture of pain and disbelief. "How could you?" His voice trembled. "David, it was a mistake," I began, desperate to explain, but he raised a hand to stop me. "A mistake?" he repeated, his voice sharp now. "It's betrayal." Nathan tried to say something, but David turned to him, his expression filled with a rage I had never seen before. "Leave. Now." Nathan hesitated, as if wanting to add something, but then nodded and left, leaving the two of us alone. David looked at me with such profound disappointment that it felt as though I were losing a part of myself. "I thought you were someone I could trust," he said quietly. I couldn't find any words. Anything I said would only make it worse. I watched as something inside him broke, something I knew could never be repaired. That night marked the end of the life I once knew. I left David's house in the morning when the sea was shrouded in a gray mist. I didn't have much to take, just a couple of suitcases and a box of books. I couldn't bring myself to face him before leaving. Our last conversation had been brief and painful. He had simply said I needed to go. His voice sounded exhausted, like that of a man who could no longer fight. Nathan had left during the night, offering no explanation. His departure was the only right choice in the mess we had created. I tried to muster the strength to justify my actions to myself, but I couldn't. The betrayal I had committed was beyond redemption. I went to San Francisco, a city that had always seemed like a place where one could start over. Life there was vibrant, noisy, full of new faces and stories. I rented a small apartment in the center of the city, where the sound of cable cars and bustling crowds drifted up to my window. I found a job at a local art gallery, where each day was filled with colors, creativity, and a sense of beauty that reminded me of what I had lost. In the first few weeks, I often thought about David. His smile, his love for sunsets by the shore, the ease of being with him. Those memories haunted me, forcing me to question what I had been looking for when I destroyed what we had. I thought about Nathan less frequently, but he lingered in my mind like an unresolved mystery. I never fully understood what he truly felt. Was it a fleeting infatuation? Or something deeper? I never heard from him again, and perhaps it was better that way.